transition to short game tempo because that's the third pillar of Wicked Smart Golf is putting. Fourth pillar is all about wedges, and that's kind of
Hmm.
where we switch to different tempos and explain the difference now with short game tempo. Again, this is going to be a big part of my new book as well that I really don't feel like I talked about enough in the first one. And the more I use your app, the more I really like just, going in there and getting some focus practice with it, the more I realize that, man, most everyday golfers short game tempo is way too slow as well. And it leads to a lot of stabby, jerky chips. You get the yips, you get all kinds of bad
Yep.
stuff, right? So
Yep.
what is the difference between Tour Tempo 1 or Tour Tempo, the original book, and then Tour Tempo 2?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Tour Tempo, the original book, was all about the full swing long game. We came out with Tour Tempo 2 after we did more research. That was more about the short game. We have all this in our current app at the moment. And the short game is a 2-to-1 ratio. And you kind of, when do you transition to that? I usually say if the lead arm is maybe below shoulders, or if you're swinging 80 to 75% of your effort,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak. Because what are you trying to do in the short game? You're trying to control distance. You're
Mm-hmm.
trying to dial in the accuracy even more.
Right. We don't
So
need
there's more
distance. Yeah. It's
there's
not
more
like we're.
time on the downswing. However, to your point, the short game backswings are actually faster than the long game backswings.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that's because think
Well, they,
about a
they
chip.
should be. I won't say
They should
most
be.
golfers are.
Why is that, right? Well,
Yeah.
a chip shot is a pretty small backswing,
Mm-hmm.
right? So same thing with a pitch or whatever it might be. So there's no reason for a chip shot to take, this really long time frame to happen. That just doesn't make sense.
Right, because I mean, if you're going long, let's say you just have like a basic chip. If you guys are watching on YouTube, if you take a swing back to your ribs or to your shoulders, if you go too far, you're gonna be like, your mind's gonna be like, oh no, we got to slow down, and then we decel. And as I talk about in the book, decel equals death. I mean, you just never
Decel
want that.
equals death, and I think a quick acceleration also equals death,
Correct? Because yeah, then
right?
you're like, oh no.
Yeah, and so the other thing that I always like bring up is Dr. Robert Grober. So Grober was a physicist at Yale. He's a brilliant mind, and he did some research, going back to the 3-to-1, kind of described the physics of it. And then he did a lot of research on the short game and putting, and it's more of a pendulum motion,
Mm,
right? And that's where you get the 2-to-1. But think about a pendulum. A pendulum is driven by gravity. Gravity never changes. So
mm.
when you see guys like Steve Stricker and the short game chef and these guys when they're hitting their pitch shots and chip shots and putts, you never see a decel and you never really see a burst of acceleration either. It's more of a pendulum, right?
Yeah.
And so they're using the same amount of force sort of back and through. And when you combine that feel with the tones of tour tempo, now you're really dialing these things in. I saw you made a great post. You were hitting some wedges to tour tempo. So we've got these tones. And we also have the
Yeah, by
voice.
the way, that's your voice now, right? So
Yeah, it's
you're
my
you're
voice
just
now. I had to,
living in my
yeah,
subconscious, John.
yeah.
I was like, I was like, is that John?
Yeah, that's me in your ear. Yeah, that's me talking in your ear. But you know what was interesting just watching that because I had somebody contact me and said, "Hey, I want to get that on my app. Why don't I have that?" Nice because he saw you using it.
Hmm.
And I said, "Hey, it's on there. Just change it to voice."
Yeah.
But you doing that, it just gives you this. I want you to talk about it, but talk about hitting wedges to the tones. What does it do for the repeatability, so to speak? I know that's kind of I don't love that word, but you have to be able to hit it. Let's just say you're hitting an 80-yard wedge.
Hmm.
You've got to know where that is in your system. How does the tempo help you with that?
So this will be a fun full story here. So I looked at my stats at the end of or the beginning of this year, in the off season was like, where am I really struggling? And it was definitely that 50 to 100. I had, distance was not a problem, but greens were okay, but that 50 to 100 was definitely a struggle bus. And so I go visit Derek Dominski of Golf Better Tucson down in Tucson. I drive
Yeah.
2+ hours for a 2 hour lesson, 2+ hours back, whatever it takes. We have a great lesson though. We go through sand and we get a few things cleaned up there, and then we go into different half wedges. And I realized I have no wedge matrix. I was playing pretty much all those 50 to 100-yard shots on feel.
I
That's
was just
not the
going to say the
best.
word feel. Yeah.
Not the
Yeah.
best strategy. And I
Yeah.
always was able to justify it with, well, I'm just a feel player. Well,
Yeah.
and then you're talking to Derek, who's, just a wizard with the short game. And he's like, well, how's that feel working? And I'm like, you're right. You're right. And I loved it. I like people challenging me. And so I spent months, literally months dialing in that matrix in January, February, March. Apparently I spent too much time on it because my wedge game improved, but the rest of my game vanished this year. So that's fun. But it's funny because I realized how much the tempo played such a big role on it.